Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second hotel educational series. We are here today with expert Dean Schmidt to talk all things Metasearch. Epic is delighted to have Dean join us. Dean, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in Meta, and we'll take it from there.
You bet. Thanks, Victoria. So yeah, actually, I've been in hospitality since about 1992. I'm going to date myself a little bit in saying that. I've been through many different fields, if you will, electronic distribution, revenue management, digital marketing, reputation management, and most recently, Metasearch. I actually started working in Metasearch back in about 2013. Went on to launch Metasearch campaigns at Wyndham Hotels, actually, before returning to Derbysoft and eventually starting my own company here at Basecamp Meta.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that introduction. And we're so glad to have you. I mean, 7 years with Metasearch is a very long time. I think, digital marketing has really evolved over the last decade. And I think, we've seen how much money hospitality brands, Marriott, Hilton, and OTAs have really put into their Metasearch efforts. So we're so excited to have you kind of talk to us today about why it's important for hotels to be thinking about Metasearch and what they can do to really optimize their position in the market. So I think let's just kick it off. What is Metasearch? There's a lot of different meta options out there. Can you really break down what is Meta?
Yeah, absolutely. So Metasearch by its nature is a site that is aggregating content from other sites. So in a manner of speaking, any search engine, be it Google or Bing or anybody else, technically they're a Metasearch site because that's exactly what they're doing. Metasearch, as it applies to hospitality, though, involves a section of those different sites where they are then aggregating points of sale from many other different vendors out there. And ultimately, they're linking off to those vendors when somebody's more interested in booking a room or whatever that point of action happens to be. And so that becomes especially relevant when we start thinking about our digital marketing and how it has evolved over the past several years, right? Because traditionally, as a digital marketing agency, you think a lot about your branded search terms, right? Branded search terms are the holy grail of my digital marketing experience. And on this slide that we have here in this example, we can see that we've searched for the New York Marriott Marquis, right? And so we've always gone through and made sure that we owned our branded search terms and came up at the top of that list. We've even gone a step further to make sure that we had our organic or SEO search all under wraps so that we knew that we would come up whenever a relevant search was done for our branded name. We'll now enter in the Metasearch component, which is what you see over on the right-hand side under your Google My Business page listing, which then they also call the Google Hotel ads. And you'll see in there that there are points of sale available within that ad. Well, now what happens is you've spent all of this time and effort optimizing everything on the left-hand side of the screen, only to potentially have an OTA go in here and occupy your premier point of sale on the right-hand side of the screen. And this is really valuable real estate when we think about it, because typically in the sales cycle, the number one drop-off point for a consumer is at the rates and availability screen. But for a Metasearch experience, the consumer has already learned a little bit about the hotel. They know where it is. They can see it on a map. They've probably looked at a few photos, so they've browsed around in those. They can see the reviews. They may have even read some of them, and they can already see the rate. So now at this point where they click on that button, there's an informed intent. They're saying, I want to book a room. And the result of that is that conversion rates tend to be much higher. And that's why we see a lot of both OTAs and the brand.coms alike wanting to make sure that they own that space. Now, it's not just Google, of course. Google is the elephant in the room, if you will. They're definitely the biggest one, but we can rinse and repeat. Yeah. But you can go to TripAdvisor, Trivago, Kayak, Bing, and a myriad of other long tail sites that are out there that are all doing these same types of mechanics.
So quick question for you. You make a great point with the high ROI. What do you think is a successful ROI metric for Metasearch? Or what, at your time at Wyndham, what benchmarks were like, okay, this is ideally where we want to be? Obviously knowing it fluctuates, but what's the ideal sweet spot, would you say?
Yeah, you bet. And that's a great question. Actually, in fact, we'll talk about goals here a little bit later on, but just in terms of finding that sweet spot where I can get the most volume for the best return, I'm usually looking for an ROI somewhere between about a 7 to a 9 to 1 return. There's going to be a lot of variables that play into that, which we'll talk about, of course, but that's usually about the sweet spot.
Okay, no, I think, that makes a ton of sense. I think this actually sets up a really great follow-up question or a great segue for us. When you think of Meta, I know there are a lot of hotel management companies that say, Metasearch is really just a channel shift. But there is a really good argument to be out there that, Metasearch can actually be a part of customer acquisition. So when you think of Meta, or when hotels think of Metasearch, which one is it? Can you break that down for me a little bit more, or how you approach it?
Yeah, it can be a little bit of both. And ultimately, it's a part of your direct booking strategy. And especially right now in this day and age with COVID being what it is, direct bookings are more important than ever because that gives you that opportunity to really control your narrative, to own that guest and have all communications with them be under your control. So if you happen to have to close your hotel next month, knock on wood, we hope that doesn't happen. But if it does, do you want to be the one contacting your guest, or do you want one of the OTAs to be the one contacting your guests? Well, you want to do it, right? So direct bookings are ever more important. But when we start talking about the channel shift part of that, we have to, again, think about it in terms of really a comparison of our branded search terms, right? So in this example here that we were talking about, we had a branded search term. Somebody was looking for that property by name, all right? So that person's already looking for your hotel, and yet we've said how important it was to own those branded search terms. Well, there are also non-branded search terms. And so this is one of the myths that we see in the industry is that Meta only provides channel shift and doesn't attract new business, but there are ways to actually attract new business for searches like hotels in New York. And we'll take, for example, Google promoted ads. They used to call it promoted hotels. Now they just call it promoted ads. So this is an example of hotels in New York, 434 hotels. And we see the Crown Plaza we're in New Orleans. I switched cities. Crown Plaza New Orleans coming at the top of that list, followed by the Holiday Inn. And I highlighted in both of those are ads, right? And so in this example, they've paid an extra cost per click to get that market ranking, so they came up at the top of that list. Now, just like a non-branded search term, this is going to have a higher cost per click. It's also going to have a different return on your ad spend because now in this example, they weren't looking specifically for you. It is a new guest acquisition. It will have a lower conversion rate, but now you are getting more exposure. And this doesn't apply just to Google. I can say the same thing on TripAdvisor. So when we look on TripAdvisor, they have TripAdvisor sponsored placements. And then even if I go into Trivago, they don't have a sponsored placements equivalent, but you'll see a little window on Trivago that specifically tells you the ranking results reflect not just your search criteria, but also the compensation paid by the booking site. What that means is that if you want to bid high enough CPC on your Metasearch points of sale on that campaign, you can actually impact your market ranking if that's what you want to do. And of course, a lot of that is about setting goals.
Yeah, no, I think, that's really interesting. And I think, there's a bunch of different questions for me, that, come to mind. Should hotels be thinking about, buying these more generic search terms when they know a big event's coming? Or is it something that they should not do because, the demand is going to be there? Really curious, how you think hotels should set up, budgeting, or how hotels really need to be looking about setting up their strategies or their goals.
Yeah, and that's definitely very important. And a lot of it depends upon exactly that question. What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? And so, almost forgot to mention that was busted, that myth, sorry. And so when we talk about goals, right, it's all about your perspective. So
Yeah.
in this example here, if we're at a $3 cost per click and a 10% conversion rate, that means it's taking 10 clicks to get a booking or a $30 cost of sale. Now, this was actually an example that came from a mega casino resort in Las Vegas a few years ago. Their nightly rates were at about $30. So if you do that math, you suddenly realize that's a 100% cost of sale. There's no way that's going to work, right? For them, it was okay, though, because their objective was to get that consumer to book with them directly, get them into their players club, get them in there with the ancillary revenues, whether that be the shows, the gambling, the food, everything else that was a bigger part of their operation than what the rooms were. So for them, that was okay, because if that same booking went through an OTA, even though it may have had a lower cost of sale, they didn't get all that other stuff with it. So that was so very important to them. You'll have other instances too. If you're $500 per night, and say you've got a 2-night length of stay, now suddenly that same example is just a 3% cost of sale, right? So everything is very relevant and very subject to what the user is doing. Now, when we start thinking about what kind of goals we want to set, and especially when we start thinking about the timeframes, is there an event in town? Is it busy? It can kind of borderline on philosophical a little bit. But again, it's about understanding the objectives between things like branding. Do I want to make sure that they're seeing my brand out there, whether I'm one of the big brands or even, let's say, an independent hotel that wants to make a name for themselves in the market? Am I focused on volume? Maybe it's all about getting that volume of bookings. And in doing so, I might be more interested in getting that traffic than I am the return on the ad spend. Owning the guest, which we just talked about, and how important that is with COVID these days. And of course, your cost of sale and your return on ad spend, also very important factors to keep in mind. But not to forget about the diversification of the portfolio, because we want to make sure that, just like with the 401k, if you're investing in stocks, we want to make sure that we've got this spread out a little bit, because you've got all your eggs in one basket. You start looking at your line graphs, they suddenly start going up and down very sharp. But if you've got that spread out a little bit, it's a lot smoother road, and you can diversify that more easily. But as I like to say, but wait, there's more. There's one other key objective too. By getting that traffic directly to my website, that now enables me to also look at a bigger picture of the marketing funnel, and that's what we call remarketing. So now that I've gotten you there, and I've got that cookie that's following you around the internet like a good stalker, now what I can do is put myself back in front of you again. It's like this example, I'm on space.com later on, and the Ramada banner ads on the left and right-hand side of the screen. And that has a very significant return. That's why you see a lot of marketers using that.
Yeah, no, I think, when you think of marketing, there is so much, right? The bigger picture, how much do you put on valuing, getting a new customer data? How much, are you trying to just get impressions out there? I think, marketing as one of the most, developed areas in hospitality over the past decade, because of all of these trackings and the ability to kind of see value, not just from, a direct transaction, but from things such as impression and customer data and acquisition. So I think, this all, makes a ton of sense. And it really plays into the larger picture, which is all good marketing campaigns kind of feed into, the next part of the purchase or the next step that you want to do. And each, it's like an ecosystem. Every part feeds itself. And so I think you did a really great job of kind of setting that up. I guess my question is then, to you is, what should hotels then expect from Meta? How should they level set their expectations and kind of give us a perspective, based on that?
Certainly. So a couple of things you want to look at. We touched on it earlier, the branded versus non-branded search terms, and just understanding that there's going to be a lot of parallels to that when we talk about Metasearch. There are ways to acquire new guests with non-branded, but it's going to have similar performance as what you see in your search engine marketing. Likewise, we also have to realize that conversion rates do matter. Sooner or later, somebody has to book a room, because if they don't, none of the math works. No matter what you're doing to optimize, if somebody doesn't book a room eventually, you're going to be in trouble. Now, one thing that we did do, though, is we took a look at some performance data from 2019, and I emphasize that because everything got thrown a little bit out of whack in 2020.
What happened in 2020, Dean? I don't know what you're referring to.
Yeah, they canceled sports. I think that was the cause of it, really. Prior to that, everything was just fine. So when we look at some of these numbers, though, what we see is that there is different segments, different types of hotels, and I could really break this down even further. These are just some examples. But starting with, one of my favorites is actually airport hotels. And these numbers, by the way, are specific to Google. But the reason I like airport hotels, Google is a very spontaneous buying process when we talk about Google Meta. So I know where I want to go. I know when I want to go there. I've got a pretty good idea which hotel I want to go to. I probably looked for it even. And to me, it's a click, click, book, and I'm out of here. I want to get through this as soon as possible. I'm ready to book now. No better candidate than an airport hotel that fits that description, right? So airport hotels are a really good fit for this. But even with that, we do see a differential between the lower price ones, say under $100. And in fact, in this example, is about $89 versus over $100. So that's kind of your limited service versus full service. And the conversion rates were fairly consistent between both of those, just over 14%. The cost per click, not a huge gap between them, but where we do see a differential is on that cost of sale. So similar conversion rate, similar cost per click, but my average booking value is significantly different. And so because of that, my cost of sale at that airport hotel under $100 ends up being much higher. And my ROAS in turn, much lower, just under a 6-to-1 on that example. By way of comparison, the over 100 category, because there was a little more revenue, a little more meat on the stick, if you will, that ROAS came in above a 9-to-1. So that worked out really well. Now, when we take that outside of the airport classification, this is where it gets really interesting. Looking at the hotels under $75. In this example, though, you'll see my cost per click went down to $1.22. So that's a big difference between what's happening with the airport hotels versus the non-airport hotels. There wasn't as much competition for that bid, and so you could get a lower CPC. Conversion rate was a little bit lower because, again, it's not the same consumer mentality, same demographic. So lower conversion rate, but the click-through rate, very strong. We had a high click-through rate on that. Cost of sale, a little bit higher than I like it. I'd kind of like to see it down below a 13, but still a return on ad spend coming up above a 7-to-1. And so we know those are very good numbers. Now, my real sweet spots come down here when we jump down a line or two to the $150 to $300 range. And what you'll see on there is I've got my cost of sale below an 11%. In fact, at 10.6 and 10.7. So really good cost of sale that we're looking at on there. But one of the things you'll see is that between my under $300 and my above $300 categories, look at my conversion rates. They went from an 8.3% to a 4.4%, practically dropping in half. And a lot of that is because when we start talking about luxury properties, there's still a great place in Metasearch for those, don't misunderstand, but now my sales cycle is a little bit longer, right? I'm not just going in there willy-nilly and saying, yeah, okay, book the hotel, click, book, and I'm done. I'm going in there and looking at the pictures. I'm planning my trip, and I've got a longer cycle that I'm going through. So my conversion rates tend to be a little bit lower. But because I've got more revenue there, my cost of sale still comes out very attractive. Where we do have to be careful is when we start looking at that cost per click there, because now we're getting dangerously high at a $4.20 cost per click, which is largely associated with what we're seeing there as the ADRs and the booking values. Last but not least, one of the goals I hear a lot of people talk about is I want to have a high impression share. I really want to get all the volume, and there's very good reasons for doing that. But we have to also understand that it's not necessarily all what you expect it to be. So in the bottom example, we looked at hotels that were above a 73% impression share on Google, looking at their average booking value and all those other numbers. Now my conversion rates suddenly go down significantly. Why is that? Well, because what starts happening when you start increasing your sample and increasing your numbers, there's what's called the law of diminishing returns, right? So case in point, if you started selling a new product. So yesterday you didn't sell any of them. Today you sold one of them. Well, that's a 100% increase, right? Let's say tomorrow you sold two of them, tomorrow you sold one more. Well, now that's only two of them versus the one you had, right? It's not, and eventually that starts leveling off. It's not as much of an increase as it was when you started. And that's just a mathematical thing that happens as you start increasing your volume. So as you get that higher impression share, yes, you get more exposure, but your click-through rate does go down. And your conversion rates will probably go down. So what you want to make sure you're doing is looking at, especially the cost per click, your conversions and your ROAS, understanding your cost of sale and what your goals are. Then I would take it another step as well in understanding what does that look like when I split it between mobile and desktop. Because when we think about those devices, there's a big difference in the performance on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think, if we look at this, I think every director of sales and marketing, every revenue director, every GM kind of looks to the side and says, okay, oh, wow, there are a lot of, 9 to 1 returns out there. That is definitely something that, piques my interest. I can drive direct business, so I can cut down on my commission shares. I can hopefully, acquire some new customer information. So this, Meta is definitely an option that I need to explore. So for those hoteliers out there, how would you tell them to set up budgeting? Because we know that's the next question out of their mouth is, this is amazing. This seems like, great returns, but how do I budget for it? Walk us through that, if you would.
Absolutely, budget. So those are the magic questions when we start talking about Metasearch. In part
it
because
is almost October.
Yeah, I know. We have to start thinking to 2021 already. But it becomes a question oftentimes of which budget does it come out of? Is this a marketing department budget, or is this a distribution department budget, or maybe none of the above? So those are the first things we have to start thinking about. We used to call it the budget volleyball game, where everybody keeps on serving it to somebody else. But there's a number of different philosophies to look at with this. So one of the first ones is based on the idea that if you shut off your Metasearch, that doesn't actually stop Metasearch from happening. It just means it's happening for somebody besides you. So now what you've done is, rather than taking the booking directly to your hotel, to your brand.com, now you've allowed Expedia or somebody else to come in there and own that point of sale instead of you. So if your cost of sale was at 12%, taking it direct, and your cost of sale through an OTA is 15%, then philosophically, why would you ever shut that off just so that you could take it at a more expensive cost of sale, right? That doesn't make sense. So philosophically, my answer is you should never shut it off. It should be uncapped. In a perfect world scenario, that would be what we want to do. Advantage to that, you're always present. You always have the historical data that you can look at, because that can be very telling and give you a lot of other information. And you can usually get that at a lower cost of sale. Disadvantage to that is just basically the reality check. And reality check is that most companies have to have a marketing budget, right? There has to be a fixed budget that goes along with that. So we'll come back to the fixed budget here in just a moment. First, though, I want to present another option, and that is for the person that has no budget at all. I don't have a marketing budget. I just can't do that at all, particularly because of COVID and what that has done to not just our industry, but even Google's industry, TripAdvisor's, Trivago's, and so on. There are options out there to use what they would refer to as commission programs. Now, in Google in particular, you have to be very careful about how you refer to this, because they have multiple variations of their commission program. There is a cost per acquisition, which is basically a pay per booking model. There's also a pay per stay model, which is a consumed reservation. That's what I consider to be the true commission model. But there's options in between there that go with that. So advantage, I don't need a marketing budget. I pay after the guest checks out. Okay, fantastic. It's just like paying a travel agent. We can work with that. Disadvantage, I have no control over this. What a commission model ends up doing is Google is going to take that data, they're going to take those conversions and the revenue that they are getting off of that and reverse engineer that, work it all the way back through the math to figure out what does this equate to as a cost per click, or what they call an effective cost per click. And that's going to determine your ranking order in those points of sale. So you don't get to control that, but it can be a good way to at least get started and get in the door. Last but not least, though, is then the CPC model. So on a CPC model, you do have that control, but of course you do need to have a marketing budget up front to work with that. So what I generally recommend, and it's hard to just say, well, allocate $500 a month. Well, allocate $500 a month doesn't make sense if your normal media spend is $100 a month, or if it was $5,000 a month. So that's a completely irrelevant number. So that's why I say make it a percentage of your media spend, because you're generally going to see the traffic flow that you're getting from Metasearch very similar. It should run parallel in many ways to what you're seeing off of other channels. So if you're doing it as a percentage of your media spend, then you just have to figure out how aggressive do I want to be. And that's going to help define what that percentage ought to be. The more aggressive, of course, the higher the percentage.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. The Epic Advisory Board a couple months ago did something on a reservation cost calculator, and we kind of took the same approach where it was, looking at your direct bookings and looking at the amount you're paying for an OTA reservation. How much money can you really play with to do efforts for things such as Metasearch? And I think, to your point, every hotel operates on a different budget. and has different expectations. And so kind of really understanding what the cost of each reservation is for you and kind of what budget you have will help to set them up for success. So I think, that is a really good way of looking at it. Continuing on that point, I did, want to talk a little more with you about, this concept of the marketing funnel. A lot of brands will talk about the funnel and kind of how hotel or what they do to really drive that. What are the different stages and how does Meta play within that marketing funnel?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about our marketing funnel, it's really made up of three primary stages. So at the top of the pyramid, if you will, you've got the prospecting. So this is where I'm going out and I'm just trying to get some recognition, trying to get my name out there, generate a little bit of interest, right? That can be anything from a billboard, if you will, to newspaper ads, magazine ads, anything that I'm doing with true prospecting on the internet actually involves where you're doing audience searching. So you've built an audience, you're looking for, I want somebody who likes long walks on the beach in October, right? So I haven't been in touch with that person at all. Think of it as a cold call, if you will, and I'm just trying to generate that interest. Then there's driving the intent. Okay, so now I've identified that, okay, here's somebody who's kind of expressed some interest. And we know that they like long walks on the beach in October. Now let me start putting content in front of them talking about long walks on the beach. And let me really try to drive that to the next phase and bring it home. And then finally, we get to direct response. And that's where Metasearch lives. And a lot of other programs live in that space as well. For me, at least, that's a really fun place for digital marketing to work because it's it's got that instant gratification, if you will. So when I start talking about how I'm tracking my data, and my attribution models, it's a very cut and clean model because I can say, yep, they booked a reservation. It was last click, same session, and I can track that directly to the revenue. Whereas something from prospecting, it's a little hard because at that prospecting stage, there might be another 30 different websites or clicks or stages in between there. And what credit does that first one get in that whole scheme of things? Direct response, though, is very easy to measure. But then we also have to take a look, I touched on this earlier, about that mobile versus desktop, because that also has a different place in all of these stages when we think about it. The spontaneity, right? If I'm driving down the road, I'm in my car and I'm looking for that roadside motel 5 miles down the road. Hopefully I'm not driving and doing it on my phone at the same time. I've got my wife over here and my son and they're navigating for me. That's what we're going to say. And so they're going on the phone and they're doing, well, that's a high intent, right? So that mobile search is very important to me. But what we see a lot of times historically is that while mobile traffic is going to exceed my desktop traffic, it also has a lower conversion rate most of the time. So we also have to make sure that we account for that and adapt for that. And then of course, within all of this, and we touched on this earlier, we want to make sure that we're getting the booking. So having the conversions on the website are so very important, and having a website that is optimized for that. Because if they get there, and there's 5 steps along the way to book that reservation, you lose conversions every step of the way. And so the reason I bring that up, because these all then play a role into the bigger picture. And I eventually like to get this all back to my site and get to that remarketing that we talked about earlier, because I know how valuable that is. But all of these play a role and come in together to create your marketing funnel.
No, I think, that makes, when you break it down like that, that makes a ton of sense. And there is, that is why brands, OTAs spend millions and millions of dollars on Metasearch campaigns and making sure that they are competing with you. And, I think at the end of the day, you own your brand. And so it's really up to you to make sure that you're taking advantage of it. And, COVID has drastically, rocked the industry that is hospitality. But what's really interesting is for the first time in a while, OTAs aren't spending like they were, and even the big brands. And so it really allows hotels to kind of come in this space for the first time and, make sure that they're getting their brand out, ahead of it. And I think, we've talked so much on this great conversation about how Metasearch works and how to budget for it. And we see that, when done right, it can really generate some good returns. So let's say we have a hotel, that's interested and they're ready to take the plunge and do Metasearch. how do they make it work for them? And what are the things that you think that are most important for them to focus on to make sure that they are successful?
Very good question. So the very first thing I'm going to talk about with that is rate parity. And I'm going to dive into that a little bit more deeply than some of these other sections because it is so very important. If you have a rate parity problem, you really need to address that first. And there's a couple of reasons that I say that. That one is the obvious reason, and that is that if somebody else has a rate that is 15% lower than yours, well, then naturally people are going to look at your rate and go, well, why would I book there, right? And so you're going to lose that booking to one of the OTAs. But one of the other things that comes into play is the fact that when you talk about your auction that determines where you're ranking in terms of those points of sale there's a cost per click that goes with each one of those. And what determines that cost per click and that ranking has a lot to do with your rate parity. So I can often get a higher rank. If I have the lowest rate, I can get a higher ranking at a lower cost per click as compared to if let's say that everybody's undercutting me and I've got the highest rate. Boy, if I want to be in that #1 spot now, it's going to cost me. It's going to cost me a lot of money, a higher CPC. So that's an important reason that we want to make sure that we've got that. Now, within the industry, you'll hear a lot of references to a phrase, or sometimes they'll abbreviate this as MBL. And what that stands for is meet, beat, lose. And that you need to know what that means, because what that's telling you is that you were meeting the lowest rate, so you were equal to the lowest rate out there. You were beating the lowest rate, meaning you were lower than everybody else, or you were losing, meaning that you were getting undercut by other people. And all of the different channels have data that reflects that will actually, in fact, if you really, some are more easily to get. Google and TripAdvisor, it's really easy to get, but all of them have it. So if you look at that information, you can get a pretty good idea how you're stacking up against your rate parity. And then it's really interesting to start looking at your conversions versus your meet, beat, lose rankings, because you'll see a direct correlation in between there. And that is really very important. So getting the lowest rate, definitely the first one that we want to make sure that we've got in that order. Next part is having clear goals, making sure that we understand what are the objectives. Are we leaning more towards that volume? I want to get as much volume as possible, which might also be a branding exercise. So for example, every time somebody searches my hotel on any of these sites, I want my point of sale coming up front and center. Okay. So maybe that's my objective. Maybe the objective is, well, I've got to have a really high return on my ad spend. Okay, so understanding what that looks like and what trade-offs we have in there. So understanding what your goals are and how that's going to impact the optimization of your campaigns and goals that you're looking at. Third one here is talking about the utilization of assisted booking models. Now, an assisted booking model is basically an example where the booking process itself takes place within the site that you originated on, that you started on. So Google, for example, has what they call Book on Google. TripAdvisor has Instant Book. Trivago has Trivago Express, and onward. So they almost all of them have some variation of this. And there are some pros and cons to these. One of the advantages is that they do tend to convert better. And that's largely because of the fact they are mobile optimized. They're country optimized. What I mean by that is they'll be in the native language of the person that's searching. And they're a very quick and efficient booking process. You never even leave the site, so it's easy to do. So yes, they do tend to convert better. Disadvantage to these, though, is that now you're outsourcing your booking process to another site. And if we haven't learned our lesson on that in the past 10 years, eventually we'll all try to get that back again, right? So we want to try to make that come to our website as much as possible, because then that's traffic that's coming to our site. But then the next thing that happens by getting to our site, we also have the ability to do that remarketing that I talked about earlier. So even though we may be getting all the guest data from one of these assisted booking models, we don't get the cookie. And that's such a very important part of that whole marketing effort. Last but not least, we have having a strategy across multiple channels. Now, to be fair, Google is the elephant in the room. Definitely the biggest channel by far, will generate the most volume, tend to have the highest conversion rates as well. But that doesn't mean that we should forego all of the other channels. We have to think about it as a more comprehensive set of marketing that we're doing. Because otherwise, even if I said that they only represent collectively maybe 25% of the business, well, are you willing to leave 25% of the business there on the table? No, probably not. But what you want to make sure that you're doing is employing what we call a cross-channel optimization strategy. And so in this example, if you look at this, we've got channels A, B, and C. And if I just look at the revenue that's being generated by them, channel A at 13,000, channel C at 18,000. Look at my returns though. Channel A, 13 to 1. We may say, hey, fantastic. Channel A is kicking it. We're doing great. But you know what? Channel A has the least amount of revenue of all these different channels. So what happens if I allow my cost per click to go a little bit higher on channel A, increase that volume and thus that revenue? Yes, I bring down my return on investment, return on ad spend a little bit. Simultaneously, though, I'm going to take my channel C, which did have the most revenue, but a very low return in comparison, and I've got to reel that in a little bit. So now that's going to generate less revenue, but now it has a higher return. If we look at my blended total now, my revenue went up by $2,000 between those two examples just by making sure I had that cross-channel optimization. Also, my return on investment went up between them as well. So you want to make sure you're looking at something that applies across the entire portfolio. Does that make sense?
No, I think that makes plenty of sense. I think everything that you've talked about today has really, shed some light on why Metasearch, is so valuable, why, big brands and, OTAs are putting so much money into this part of the marketing funnel. And I think, hotels, like I said earlier, are really well positioned to kind of jump in the game if they haven't been in it, or take advantage of it now because people aren't spending like they are. And I think you've given us a lot to think about. Take this cross-channel optimization. There are a lot of different things that hotels need to be thinking about when it comes to Metasearch. And you clearly are an expert in all of this. And so if I have a hotel that's interested in doing Meta and activating Meta, how should they reach out to you? What do you recommend? Because I'm sure we're going to have a lot of interest after this.
Well, fantastic. Yeah, and they're certainly welcome to reach out to me. You can visit my website at basecampmeta.com or also go and email at info@basecampmeta.com. All those come to me. And Victoria, how can they reach you?
Well, you can come to us at our website, so epic-rev.com or info@epic-rev.com. We are always trying to help hotels, especially in this crisis, how we can all help each other get out of this and come out on the other side. And so, Dean, I want to thank you for this. Our hotel educational series is so important to us because we believe that through information is how hotels are going to be able to kind of become their most profitable selves. And so it is through great people like you who can help, inform us on these great efforts that we're able to provide this content to hotels. So I wanted to thank you for your time. And hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you, Victoria.
Thanks.